To go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to the first of our fall series of classes. Today we're talking about native wildflowers from seed and bulb. So a little different take from some of the native classes we've done in the past. We do have a hybrid class, so we have people in the seats here and we have people online, and I appreciate all the attendance. For my online people, I can't really tell exactly what's happening, so if we have an issue, if you just let me know in chat, I'd appreciate it. And ask all the online audience to please stay muted. If you do have questions, you can put them in chat. I'm going to try to reserve questions to the end to the best of my ability, because otherwise we bog down pretty rapidly sometimes. So welcome. My name is Darren Morgan. I'm the nursery manager here at Shonnard's. So I wanted to take a chance here to talk about some of the more passionate things in my landscape right now. And the native plant thing is something that we've been advocating for a long time, and we really feel like it's finally catching on and people are really starting to take it seriously. So it's a wonderful thing to see, and it's allowed us a good number of opportunities to do things that we were never really able to do economically before, and in particular that is to have availability of actual locally collected wildflower bulbs, native bulbs, and locally collected seeds available for planting. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And if you don't see your favorite native plants on there, it may be an omission of time, or it may be because they don't really quite fit into the ideal seed and bulb category. And I would be happy to talk about other natives beyond that at the end as we go through. So, native plants. Native wildflowers in particular. Native plants, of course, are what you see around you besides the human introduced and interventions. But all native plants kind of give a sense of place, of fitting into your environment. Native wildflowers are a particularly poignant reminder of what is and is not local in our area. So that integration to your local environment is one of the main reasons why people enjoy natives. Another big reason for working with natives, of course, is they tend to require less attention. Typically, an introduced species requires consistent interventions to match, in some degree, its native environment. Native plants, as long as you are siting your native plants in the locations that they enjoy, because they tend to be somewhat specific about their requirements, often don't have these care issues. They should be well adapted to the stressors and pests and diseases they're likely to run into. Another huge advantage to working with native plants is wildlife and pollinator resource. Of course, honeybees are one thing, but honeybees aren't native. We have a couple of hundred species of native solitary bees and a batch of native bumblebees, hummingbirds, wasps, a few beetles, hoverflies that are all native pollinators. All of our indigenous pollinator species co-evolved with these specific plants. This is what they're looking for a food source, even though they will often settle for something that's not native. So they typically match not only pollinator preferences and wildlife preferences, but also timing. And that becomes increasingly important when you start talking about native solitary bees, which have any individual species often has a very short period of activity, just weeks of adult activity. Blue orchard mason bee is a classic example of solitary bees. They emerge early in the spring, well before the honeybees are active. They have an adult cycle that's about 6 weeks for the entire adult cycle for that species. They can go through their reproductive stages, they lay eggs, and then their entire 11 months of the year basically is egg and larval development. So they have to have food resources that they can utilize during those periods. And of course, they have those periods of activity because there were originally native species that they were pollinating. So native resources are particularly important for native birds, mammals, and pollinators. And a good reason to incorporate, even if you don't go all the way native, to incorporate some natives into your landscape. So when we're talking about doing natives from seed and bulb, where the focus here is going to be on the wildflowers. And the wildflowers break into broadly 2 groups, but it's kind of confusing. Annuals are flowers that tend to complete an entire life cycle in 1 year. So they seed in the ground, they grow, they flower, they set seed, and the parent plant dies. They're dependent on the ability to reseed to come back. A fairly substantial percentage of our native wildflowers are reseeding annuals. Perennials tend to come back year over year from the same root mass. So a life cycle on a perennial is seed in the ground, that plant grows, usually doesn't flower the first year, though there are some exceptions, might start flowering 2, 3, 5, in extreme cases, 10, 12 years after seed germination for the first flower. And they have to come back from the parent root system. That parent root system is going to be a fibrous root system. The plant just dies back to the ground and continues to regrow from a central core like that. Or it can be specialized storage organs, which are bulbs and rhizomes and tubers that enable a plant to have a better success rate and tenacity in challenging environments. That's one of the biggest reasons those types of developments happen in plants, is the ability to store nutrients in looking forward to coming back the next year stronger and stronger. But it's not as simple as that, unfortunately. There are biennials. Biennials act kind of like an annual, but they usually don't flower the first year from seeds. The life cycle on a biennial is seed in ground, plant grows, gets some size, gets some mass, doesn't flower. Plant dies back, comes back the second year, puts in a ton of energy into a heavy flower display, and then sets seed. The parent plant dies off, the seedlings recur the next year. We don't have a ton of biennials, true biennials, in our native flora. That is something you see in things like hollyhocks, is a classic example of a traditional biennial plant. Perennials, we kind of assume, are going to keep going from a parent plant over and over. That's not always true for long periods of time, and often this has to do with specific characteristics of site adaptations. So perennials that are maybe first in on disturbed soils may come back strong for a few years. They tend to get supplanted by more mature species as that soil and site develops and stabilizes, and then they kind of peter out. And we have this in the shrub world in the natives too. A number of them are relatively short-lived first-in species. So just because it's perennial doesn't mean it's going to be there forever. And again, they do tend to reseed and reestablish themselves as long as sites are good. But what happens in like a mixed wildflower situation, like in the wet prairie out here along the Willamette, is you'll see successions. You'll have things that come in, and then the grass is established, and the grasses get bigger and more dense. They tend to choke out some things, but other things that either grow in between the main grass cycles or are big enough to compete spatially with those grasses become the dominant forbs in that environment. And you get this transition. Then when the site gets cleared out by erosion or man-made activity or fire, then this whole cycle kind of starts over again, and seeds that have been dormant in the ground can come back and help reestablish those introductory species again. So those are kind of the patterns. Why is such a focus on annuals? Well, because it's so much of what's out there, number one. We have a great substantial amount of our native wildflowers are annual, and a few biennials and short-lived perennials in the mix too. So if you really cut out annuals because you don't want to go to the trouble of trying to reestablish them when they peter out, you are really limiting your available palette of native plants. Typically, annual plants are very successful reseeders, either because they have an extremely good seed viability, in other words, a high percentage of the seed germinates, because the seed has great dormancy characteristics, like lupin, where it can stay in the soil for many, many years and then grow when the site conditions are appropriate. Or because they just set so much seed that some of it gets through. And that's why we see so many of these wildflower seed packages have little bits of seed, and they're like 500 square feet worth because the seeds are so tiny. Annuals provide a good way to broaden your mix, and because the annuals are done from seed, it tends to be a relatively inexpensive way, even if you do have to retouch it every few years. Another advantage to doing annuals within a mix is annuals have an ability to grow very rapidly. They have to. They have to get in and establish themselves and get up to reproductive size and reproduce all within one season. So they tend to be pretty effective at suppressing competing plants, particularly plants that you're trying to choke out of your otherwise native garden. The other big thing of doing annuals from seed is that they do bloom first year from seed consistently. And that, most perennials do not, only a very few do. And some of the perennials, Trillium's a classic example, can take a decade before they can bloom from reseeding. So it gives you a chance to add some instant success into a mix of otherwise more durable plants to have instant satisfaction. So availability of these plants, just because you can do it from seed doesn't mean you have to or even should do it from seed. Seeds are an inexpensive option, but not all plants do well from seed. And the biggest classic example I want to touch on in that is milkweed. There's been a lot of emphasis on native milkweeds and trying to get them established. And it is certainly possible to do native milkweed from seed, but it's a pain to do milkweed from seed. It takes a long time to bloom, and the success rate is relatively low as a percentage of the total. It's not always the most practical, and for some things you just can't get them to seed enough viability to make that commercial. In other words, we can't afford to sell you seeds because too few of them germinate well. There is a lower success rate from seeding than transplanting or planting from bulbs. There's just simply more that can go wrong. On the other hand, you can put thousands of plants worth of seed out there for the cost of a single plant in a finished plant. In a few plants, and then particularly in the case of reseeding annuals, seeds really are the only way you can get them. Nobody's commercially producing native annuals. I've tried it a couple of times, and we've sold a few 6-packs, but it's not, the marketplace just isn't there for the cost and expense of producing it. And the thing you want to keep in mind, the other thing you want to keep in mind on the native plant is timing. So native plants from seed have specific periods you really need to do it in. This is because they are adapted to very specific growing conditions. So most of your native wildflowers, particularly reseeding annuals, start growing about now. That being said, we mean now in the sense that you get the seed in the ground and they start developing as the rain and the cold comes in. A substantial chunk of our native flowers and a few of our grasses, but primarily the flower stuff, requires extensive cold stratification, extensive periods of cold, wet weather, or the seed remains dormant. So for many plants, this means 12, maybe even 16 weeks of cold, wet weather below 45 degrees and wet. We get that from seedings done in October, November, December, even into January. By the time you're getting to February, maybe March, we're starting to see that the really pickiest plants, the ones that have the most stringent cold stratification requirements, don't perform as well from seedings done that way late because they're just not consistently getting the cold and wet they need. So fall seeding is the dominant time to do that. So transplants, on the other hand, give you some other options out there. And of course, if you're gung-ho on it, you can certainly get seeds, start your own plants in cell packs or 4-inch plants, and then transplant them for some of the things that are a little tricky from seed. That's a viable approach. Not all plants are readily available from transplants for economic reasons, as well as sometimes from difficulty in getting a finished product to market. But they tend to have the highest overall success rate if you're reasonably careful. Transplanting is a more surefire way. So the trade-off there is that you can't put thousands of plants out there, but if you're putting 10 plants out there, you can be pretty more certain that those 10 plants are going to succeed to a high percentage. In many cases, this is really the only commercial availability of plants. There's a lot of things that just aren't available either as seed, as bulb, or as bulb in the native plant. You get a chance to get more mature plants. This is really important for perennials and shrubs. You do a shrub from seed and you got 3 or 4 years before it's really handleable in many cases. Some of the perennials take so long to bloom that having a chance to get an older plant grown in a pot and then plant it in the ground gives you a more satisfactory experience and better able to adapt to sudden stresses like flooding, drought, animal predation, or other inclement conditions. And one of the big things about doing transplants is, provided you can find what you're looking for in a transplant, you can plant them year-round as long as you're reasonably cautious. We plant all winter, we plant spring. You can plant in the summer with good irrigation and caution. So you do have a wider option of planting times. Bulbs are kind of in between. They tend to be more expensive than doing from seed by a goodly measure. They're comparable in cost to transplants, but a little less. There's only a certain grouping of native plants that are available as bulbs, but the bulbs that are available are usually quite successful. Bulbs are relatively older, just like buying a transplant. You typically are buying a plant that has been grown from original seeding date was a couple of years ago by the time you buy a bulb. So they often flower the first year. They have a good chance of establishing and resisting competition stress. The vast majority of plants you can get as bulbs, you can also get as transplants. Some of them, however, are difficult, challenging, or only rarely available due to scarcity. Bulbs are the pickiest way in terms of planting time. So native bulbs are a little different from daffodils and crocuses. They have to have the right environmental conditions before they can harvest them, which means, like for us at the store right now, camas bulbs are here, but the rest of our native bulbs are still trickling in, and they will for the next month as conditions improve in the harvest field so they can actually collect them. And they don't have much durability in storage. They don't dry well and then ship all over the world or out of the country. They have really limited storage capability. They tend to dehydrate or rot, one or the other, pretty readily. So it's something you want to get is as they come available, get in the ground within a few weeks and be done with them, because they're not going to hold for you. So very short season of available time to work with native bulbs. Okay, we're going to go through some species by species of some of the main ones and give a little bit of the details about them. And then we'll do it at the end. We'll talk a little bit more about integrating this information into your landscapes. Yarrow, so it's alphabetic, no preference except alphabetical by Latin name, because that's the way we botanists tend to do things. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium. Our native yarrow is white or tends heavily white, as you see in the picture. That being said, there are disjunct populations in a group of either yellow or pink flowered varieties. Any given stand is likely to have some admixture of flower colors. Achillea millefolium was used in breeding a lot of the commercial yarrows, although they're not pure native at that point. Yarrow is a super adaptable plant, everything except the very wettest sites and in sun to partial shade, and actually a fair amount of shade. They do tend to choke out in really substantial shade. Yarrow is a very, very simple plant to grow. If you want to get your feet wet on working with native plants from seed, yarrow is a good choice. The germination success rate is very good. It's very adaptable. So super easy to do. It's also available as transplants if you want to get something up. Here's our emergency alarm at 11:20, our national award. I was going to say something at the beginning of class, and I got caught up in my talk and totally forgot. There we go. I guess it works. We're on the alert. Yarrow makes a great drought-tolerant plant, and unlike so many of our native drought-tolerant plants, it doesn't absolutely resent irrigation, so you can integrate it into more comprehensive landscapes that are not strictly native. Flowering onions. We actually have several native onions. Allium validum, swamp onions, pretty common out here. Allium implectans. Allium cernuum, the one with the upside down nodding flower heads, nodding onion. They are perennials. They tend to be pretty persistent perennials, all in all. Most of them are full sun. A lot of them will tolerate some shade. None of them like much shade. All will tolerate reasonable moisture. However, not all will tolerate swamps. Cernuum, validum are substantially wet environment alliums, but some of them are definitely not. Implectans, for example, tends to go uphill a little bit more. Alliums are often available as seed, are often available in transplant, and can be found frequently as bulbs as well, making them very adaptable and versatile for planting options. So alliums are incredibly enticing to bees and to many, many butterflies. So when you get up in the mountains and you see all the wild alliums flowering through the swampy rockwork there, they're almost always covered in butterflies during their bloom season. Another high success rate plant that, as long as it's not getting really bone dry, tends to hold up quite well. It's worth mentioning that alliums tend to grow, flower, and senesce. A lot of our native bulbs go through that habit. So they typically don't have much summer presence in your landscape. They've got that late spring, early summer bloom, or slightly earlier bloom, depending on species, and then they go dormant. The more you irrigate them, or the wetter the initial environment, the more they tend to stay put. Allium cernuum, however, does not exhibit that. The bigger nodding onion will keep foliage this summer as long as it's reasonably irrigated. So it doesn't have to be completely empty space in the summer. Western columbine is one of those archetypes of Western wildflowers. We think of columbine from the introduced species as being a kind of a frilly, delicate little thing, and our not Western is not. A well-established clump can reach 4 or 5 feet in height and as wide. Flowers are relatively small compared to commercial columbines, but are profuse. So it's really easy to pick them out in the landscape during their bloom, because you're walking up through the woods and break out into some of those meadows, and you'll see these huge clumps of columbine along the edges. A truly full perennial with a good lifespan as a perennial, and preferring some that will tolerate some shade. Not really its best in deep shade. A good drought-tolerant plant is typically from well-drained environments. They will tolerate some moisture, but not substantial winter wet feet. So sometimes a little challenged in our heavier clay sites. The Aquilegia columbines are available as seed and fairly straightforward to do from seed. Good percentage overall take. Are frequently done as transplants because most people don't need several hundred columbine at a time. Showy milkweed, of course, the monarch's critical habitat plant. We have a couple of native milkweeds, Asclepias speciosus, Asclepias fascicularis. The fascicularis typically doesn't make it up into our range. It's California and Southern Oregon native, but speciosus is widespread where it still survives. Of course, development and farming have really wiped out a lot of the native populations. So perennial and a bit of a thug. It's a plant that gets maybe 4 feet tall and spreads by rhizomes. So it has underground root systems that are reproductive as well, and they spread along, and everywhere they can, they'll pop up more plants. So they continue to expand until something stops them, unfavorable conditions or other physical barriers stops them from spreading. So a single plant can easily be, 3 or 4 feet tall and 4 or 5 feet across by 4 or 5 feet across. They are critical habitat for monarchs from a larval food source. Many other butterflies and many bees also use them as a nectarine source. So they're good for pollinators besides just the monarchs. They are drought tolerant within limits. Their ideal environment, one of the reasons they are somewhat challenged, is their ideal environment is kind of a narrow range. They like some moisture during the initial growing phases in the spring, but they prefer to dry out as the summer progresses. So they don't really do well in consistently wet environments, unlike a lot of the other milkweeds, or a lot of the non-native milkweeds really are swamp plants. On the other hand, they don't really grow in really bone dry locations without some spring irrigation. So getting the site right is kind of important with showy milkweed. They can be done from seed, but the seed germination percentage is low. The survival to a point where they can actually flower, which takes several years, is not all that high. They are temperamental and tricky plant. They're much easier to do from a rhizome. Rhizomes typically come available late in the native bulb cycle. We sometimes see them by November. We sometimes don't see them until January. That's not uncommon. They're also frequently available as transplant and not too difficult from transplant, provided you can provide the appropriate site for them. Harvest ways. So I kind of simplified this because there's so many. We'll cover a couple others in here, but the Brodia Alliance, and of course I learned several of the other bulbs as Brodias as well, but they've clinically separated out the genera a little bit, are bulbous perennials that were widely eaten by the indigenous peoples, just like camas, smaller bulb, however. Typical Brodias are from upland environments, with relatively good drought tolerance. However, Brodia coronaria is a emergent wetland species. So it's a plant that, as the vernal pools dehydrate down in the late spring, flowers out and then goes dormant for the rest of summer. So it's kind of the outlier in that group. Most of the others prefer it a bit drier. Interesting characteristic that's very illustrative of bulb adaptations in general. Plant emerges, foliage is out, insignificant. It looks like a little tiny clump of grass. It's that type of a foliage. The foliage begins to die down, and the flower stalk starts coming up. And typically by the time they're in bloom, most of the foliage has died off. So they don't have a long persistence in the environment. That's a super good adaptation for challenging environments like vernal pools, where you have a really brief season to get established and reproduce, and you don't want to be wasting your energy on times when it's not suitable for reproductive activity. So they tend to focus on a very narrow range of time. They do naturalize well once they're established. That's one of the reasons the indigenous people harvested them. There was plenty of them around, and they're a good starch resource. All of them tend to varying shades of bluish purple, some of them a little more towards white. And we'll cover a couple other close cousins a little bit further down the dock here. One of the most stunning wildflowers available from bulb is the mariposa, butterfly lily, or pussy ears, calochortus. There are, I forget how many species in California and into Oregon and throughout the Pacific Northwest. That pretty much is the range of calochortus. This is where they're all from. We have Calochortus tolmii here in the valley and through the Coast Range. There are several more species of Calochortus throughout Oregon, most of them at somewhat higher elevations. And you get up in the mountains, you'll see a whole batch of them and various different ones. I'm not great at separating them out because they're all fairly similar overall. They will tolerate sun. They do quite well in quite substantial amounts of shade, so partial to moderate shade. They are difficult to get established. They are temperamental, but once they're established, they tend to persist very well. One of the things that makes them challenging is they really like well-drained soils. You'll find them growing like up outside of Lewisburg on some of those hilly areas, but you won't find much of them growing down here in the wetter soils on the valley floor. Drainage is very important to them. This is a plant that doesn't do well from seed. This should be either done from a transplant or from a bulb. Camas, the signature Pacific Northwest wildflower. Camassia, there's actually two major species, Camassia quamash, the common camas, Camassia lactlinii, the greater camas, and some subspecies variations from there. Typical flower color is blue. There are outlying populations of white. You'll find white flowered ones mixed in with the blue. Be aware that if you are foraging, that there's also some somewhat similar looking plants that flower white that are very poisonous, steppe camas, which is not a camas, but be aware of that. Really hard to tell them apart from a bulb. Pretty easy to tell them apart when you're seeing them growing side by side. These are wetland bulbs. These grow in situations that are moist to underwater for long parts of the season. So you'll see camas growing up in flooded, wet prairies, but you'll also see camas growing in upland sites that aren't completely bone dry, that actually have some moisture retention through the spring cycle. They love sun. They will tolerate some shade. Camassia quamash typically is your more upland species and is more drought tolerant, but Camassia lactlinii is more commonly found mixed in under trees a little bit. They are really, really hard to tell apart if it matters to you specifically in the field. You learn your specific identification keys because even though they're greater and common, the size variation is not that significant. The color variation is not significant. The leaf variation is not significant. And all about the little bit minor variations in petal formation and shape is what separates the species. Camas is a great introductory species to play with. You can get them as finished plants, you can get them as bulbs, you can plant them from seed, and they tend to have a pretty high success rate. A real common approach for people who are wanting to play with some extensive amounts of space in a native environment is to plant a handful of plants or bulbs, and then as they get up to flowering age, just every year collect a few of the seed pods as they finish flowering out and seeding and just scatter them in. They tend to naturalize themselves quite well. Very easy to grow, very easy to handle. Tending to be a relatively long-lived perennial, and of course the true camas are quite edible and we're a local staple. So a truly annual farewell to spring, or sometimes just called Clarkia amina is ours. One of the more intense, bright patches of hillside color in the spring, growing in primarily sunny locations, though they will tolerate a little bit of shade. A nice drought-tolerant plant for rockeries or upland environments, and does not do well typically down here on the wet valley again. Very easy to grow from seed, has a high germination rate, and as you would expect from a reseeding annual that's completely dependent on for its survival on being able to reseed, it seeds easily and establishes itself pretty freely. If you plant Clarkia in a mixed flower situation, it will kind of take over for a little while, and it will tend to be choked out by somewhat larger and more aggressive plants over time. But does a really good job of filling in some spaces. Another one that I learned is Rhodea, but isn't, Diclostema, or Ukao, is another one of those harvest lilies with an edible bulb, truly perennial. Ukaos can be anywhere from truly white with some blue tinges to mostly blue, and they tend heavily towards the blue, not towards the white. They're very drought tolerant. This is something, again, we see up in the hills rather than down here on the valley floor much. Very easy plant from bulb, can sometimes be found as a transplant. You can do them from seed, and you can spread your seed, collect your seed yourself and spread some that way, but the germination rate and establishment rate isn't that great, so they typically are done from bulb by preference. Shooting star, Dodecathion, again, a very widely distributed genus of plants throughout the Pacific Northwest. You'll find several species at different locations throughout the state. Our local here in the valley is Dodecathion hendersonii. The inside-out flower is unmistakable. There's not much else that looks like that with that much flower size. They typically grow in full sun. They will tolerate a little bit of shade. The typical environment for them is situations that are seasonally wet or moist, not underwater, but dry out fairly rapidly in the season. And so you will see them on meadows that are up above the streams but are near the streams, and other moist but not sopping wet environments. That's not true for all shooting stars. You see a whole batch of them in the mountains that are truly wetland species. They grow right in the stream banks. Easiest way to do Dodecathion is from bulbs, but the bulbs are really brittle. They're the funniest looking bulb you'll ever see. It's a little tiny pip with two little fleshy wings that come out from it, and that's it. And it is, I mean, the whole bulb is, yeah, tiny. The wings easily break off. That does not necessarily invalidate the bulb. As just part of the storage. The actual pip itself, that central piece, is the growing focus. I tend to do them by transplant myself because they're not super expensive as a transplant, and the success rate is very high. And you know, one of those anecdotal stories about how adaptable they are. I had a customer gift me a batch of Dodecathion that was coming out of her yard that she was relocating, and she dug up a whole batch of them and didn't need all of them. And as I would do in the spring, because you know this is what I do for a living, I took them home and I threw them on a chunk of weed barrier fabric out in my plant bone pile out there and just ignored them for months. And I came back when I finally had time in July. So, well, they're dead, but they're there and they're holding the weed barrier fabric down. So we'll just kind of let that be, which was well and good. Next spring, they just started growing on top of the weed barrier fabric with a little bit of soil that was still adhering around them. So they're quite tough once they're established, very durable plant. The bulbs themselves a bit fragile, so be careful handling. Fawn lily, another upside down. I don't know how we have so many interesting upside down flowers, but we do. Fawn lily is in the lily group, Erythronium. Erythronium oregonum is our local native, typically off-white to creamy yellow. Good perennial for a shadier environment. This is a plant that does not do well in full sun. It really is that mixed shade to shade. On the coast, similar Erythronium revolutum, but it's pink and well worth incorporating. It does fine in the valley if you want to incorporate some, but its true native environment is west of the coast range. So a drought-tolerant plant, we often incorporate these with various forms of small herbaceous perennials and ground covers to create an overall thicket on the floor of a given landscape underneath the trees. You can also introduce Erythronium into a shady lawn situation with some caveats. They resent summer irrigation. They're quite drought tolerant, and they don't like to be watered after they go dormant in the summer. The other thing is, of course, if you're putting them in a lawn situation, this needs to be an unmowed during their flowering and reproductive season. So wait until they dormant down, and then you can go back to mowing, but let them establish well. Otherwise, you will constantly keep them pruned back to an unhealthy level. Besides seeding themselves off, which they do pretty efficiently, if you look at our native landscape back here in the ground back here at the nursery, you will find a substantial percentage of it has become Erythronium over the years. They both produce little bulbils off the parent bulb and seed themselves. So they do naturalize quite well. They're not an inexpensive plant. They're kind of difficult to produce in the nursery industry. So you'll spend a little money for them, but you don't need to overindulge to get a nice crop going. You just have to have a little patience. I love the fritillarias. We're stretching the definition of native really to get into this range. Fritillaria finis, I think of primarily as more of a Southern Oregon thing than really here in the valley, and then again on the coast. Perennial bulb, sun, shade, part shade, not deep shade. This is a plant, again, from a kind of a rockery environment. So make sure you're providing adequate drainage. And the biggest cause of mortality we see here is too heavy a soil or too consistently wet. Another plant that totally resents summer irrigation. It needs to be dry in its dormant period. It's never an easy plant. You will sometimes find seed or transplants. It is usually available as a bulb when it's available at all. There's nothing else quite like it. And there's a couple of different fritillarias here. And of course, there's fritillarias from other parts of the world as well that exhibit this, what they call a checker lily or chocolate lily pattern, where they have a base color and then they have these kind of checkerboard flecks of a very dark color adjacent to it, which makes them quite stunning in the landscape. Gilia, bluehead gilia, great pollinator resource. Native bees, native wasps, honeybees, bumblebees all appreciate gilia. It's a later blooming annual with that classic blue color that really is a signature of bee-loving plants. For a sunny environment, again, partial shade. Dryland environments with gilia. Again, a lot of the gilias are California species, needs reasonable drainage. They don't need extensive drainage. Just a little bit of elevation in a flower bed will be quite enough to grow gilia unless you're in a truly wetland environment. As is true of most of our truly annual natives, really the only way you see bluehead gilia is as a seed. You don't really see it available in other forms. Our native irises, we'll hit a couple of big ones. There's actually a batch of native irises, and they do tend to break down into little regional groupings, like along the Columbia Gorge has its own groups. But Iris 10X and Iris douglassiana are both pretty widely distributed throughout our range. They're both fully perennial. You can sometimes get them as a crown, like a fibrous root crown, dormant, but that's pretty scarce. More commonly, you're either going to seed them or you're going to get them as a transplant. It's another plant that exhibits good seed dormancy, so it comes back, years later, sometimes from seed after a site is disturbed. They tend to prefer sun. They will both tolerate some shade. There are some differences between them. Typically, Iris 10X has a narrow leaf that's very, very, very substantially durable, but tends to, depending on the weather, go dormant in the winter here. It tends to have a dry down period. Iris douglassiana has the more sickle-shaped leaf and tends to be more evergreen. Otherwise, they're relatively hard to tell apart, and they do sometimes occur intermixed in the wild. We show the picture of the classic blue one. In the wild, you will see, again, a substantial amount of color variation within them. And of course, the iris family, whether it's our natives or introduced species, tend to interhybridize. So you will sometimes see hybrids amongst the species involved. The Pacific iris hybrids, Pacific Coast hybrids, are examples of intentional crosses between some of these irises. You might find yellow or white iris flowers intermixed in any given population of blue. You can do them from seed, but it might be 3 to 5 years to bloom. So bear that in mind, it takes some patience. Transplants are super easy. They're a very hardy plant. Like a lot of seeds that exhibit long-term dormancy, besides just the cold stratification, you might want to take a few steps when planting iris from seed. Either a long soak, water just short of boiling, drop the seeds in it and let it cool down overnight, leaving the seeds in it. They're repeating. They didn't say they were going to do that. Or you can do some minor etching with a nail file. Acid scarification is a little more tricky, so I won't go into that in much detail, but some way to break the dormancy of the hard seed coat before you put them out and let the weather finish the job for you. Lupins. So lupins, there's a batch of lupins. Out here we see a lot of lupins, Polyphyllus and Lupinus rivularis. both kind of wetland lupins, but there are plenty of high, dry alpine lupins as well. Wild lupins are widely distributed throughout Oregon, and I don't know how many species, lots and lots of species. We tend to think of lupin as that kind of blue to bluish purple color. That's certainly not absolutely true in any given population. Within most species exhibits some variation. It's worth noting that Lupinus polyphyllus often tends, as you see in the picture here, and this is in our native landscape, towards this kind of buffy, creamy tan instead of a blue, which makes it a very unusual flower color all in all. So lupins can be little tiny alpine things, but our local natives tend to be pretty substantial. Lupinus polyphyllus easily reaches 3 or sometimes 4 feet in size. So you get a plant going there, and all of a sudden you've got this 4 foot by 4 foot mass in full flower. They do seed heavily. The seed is toxic to eat. Issue really only for kids and pets because nobody's going to try to eat it a lot. It does exhibit some delayed dormancy, so it does tend to come back again after disturbance after a long period of time. And it does tend to make them a plant that somewhat becomes a taking over risk in the landscape. So you may need to police the seedlings coming up in your native landscape to make sure it doesn't become just a lupin landscape. I love sea blush. It's one of those little minuscule plants that you would walk right by in the yard or the ditch until you see a mass of them all in bloom, and then there's this carpet of solid pink. A true annual, so dependent upon reseeding to establish for sunny or partial shade environments. This is a good thing to throw on a rock wall that has little pockets, or on a little ledge of space where you've only got a little tiny bit of soil. We spilled part of a package of seed on top of a log in the native landscape one year, and we had basically 3 years of sea blush growing on the bark of the log. That was enough footing and moisture for them to be happy in. They're easy to start, they naturalize well. As you get bigger species in there, they do tend to be supplanted by larger plants, but just a beautiful little plant in the right spot, and do plant plenty of them if you're going to bother, because they're really only effective in mass. Prunella, self-heal. Prunella vulgaris, subspecies vulgaris, is ours. Truly perennial, makes a great ground cover to a fault. It will creep into anything. So it reseeds, but also spreads vegetatively. A plant that thrives in shade, will tolerate, but doesn't do its best in full sun. Anything from shade up to full sun, everywhere in between. Adaptable to quite a reasonable amount of moisture, but not to truly underwater or saturated sites, and quite drought tolerant once established. You can get it readily from seed. It's very easy to grow from seed. You can also buy it as transplants if you want a little bit of a jump start. This becomes a key component for us, and again, establishing native ground coverings for a site to make sure we're not getting too many weeds in. Excellent plant with a long history of medicinal uses as well. You will find it varies quite a bit. If you get a really full sun environment and lots of competition, your self-heal may stay almost strawberry-like, growing flat along the ground and just an inch and a half tall with little tiny leaves and little tiny flowers. You get a shadier environment where the shade and the competition of the trees has kicked out a lot of the other competing forbs and grasses, and so it's got a decent amount of spreading space. And it creeps up to maybe a foot tall, and with flowers being quite a bit more dramatic. I love the checker mallows, the sedalcias. This is our version of hollyhocks. So the other world has various alceas and sedalcias. We have the checker mallow group of sedalcias, and basically 3 are pretty common here. Sedalcia virgata is a relatively short-lived perennial. Sedalcia campestris is a paler and slightly more shade-tolerant sedalcia. Sedalcia cusickii is your really wetland sedalcia. We even grow them in the ponds sometimes as an aquatic plant. So sun to partial shade, with campestris being the most shade tolerant, and virgata being the least. They all love wet soil, but they will tolerate drying out by simply going dormant. So as long as you don't mind the briefer surge of flower and foliage interest, they will tolerate seasonally wet and seasonally dry environments just fine. They're not too hard to do from seed. You don't get a huge percentage take, but there's enough take to make them worthwhile and an inexpensive way to get a batch of them. They can be very easy to do from transplants, available usually in 4-inch or gallon containers. Like a lot of these okay from seed plants, if you want a batch of them, it's quite worth buying a package of seed and just starting them in 6-packs and then transplanting them out. You'll have a higher percentage take over the overall that way and a little more certain establishment. So the checker mallows are critical habitat. Different species of checker mallow are critical habitat for a variety of butterflies as a larval food source. They're a nectary resource for hummingbirds, bees, and butterflies. A very valuable plant in the landscape. Another plant that I learned back as a Brodia, in fact, it still carries the name white Brodia, the Tritelias. Ours is Tritela hyacinthina. And despite the Brodia name and the hyacinthina name, they're pretty much white at first glance. When you get a good close look at them, you'll see that blush of blue or sometimes lilac flushing through them. But the dominant color when you look at them at any distance at all is white. Another hardy bulb with an edible bulb for a sunny location, and typically very adaptable. They don't tolerate underwater or truly flooded environments, but they'll tolerate everything from moist to quite dry. Occasionally, you can find them as plants to plant. They are almost exclusively available as bulbs, really the only way we see the true native one. Tritelia hyacinthina has many cultivated forms and hybrids that have been done and are not at all uncommon in the bulb trade, but our native one is somewhat scarce. Trilliums. So I love trilliums. Again, another iconic Pacific Northwest plant. They are a royal pain to grow. I don't want you to get your hopes up about it. They require shade and reasonable moisture, but not underwater environments. So you can't plant them in the really dry locations, but they do not tolerate flooding either. They're incredibly sensitive to handling, both as a plant transplant or bulb, and also after they're established in the landscape. They don't even like to be walked around or cultivated around. They're temperamental. Seed to flower, depending on species, site, and situation, can be as much as 10 years. This is why you don't see more of them in the trade. They're incredibly expensive to produce with a high loss percentage. Best way to handle them, when you can, is to get bulbs and get them in the ground and then leave them alone. Next best is as transplant, and seed is a last resort because they're very, very difficult. When all that's been said and done, if you can get them established, they're wonderful. Just don't plan on moving them ever. They will almost certainly die. Yeah. Wildflowers. So I'm used to seeing these up at elevation. You know, I'll be honest, a lot of my outdoor time is spent in like the Cascades and the Wallowas and places like that. It was kind of revelation to me when one of the guys I used to work with here introduced me to our local native, Wildflower angustifolia. Well, how does it live here? I'm used to seeing these huge taproots. I'm used to seeing these on these rocky hillsides, stabilizing the hillside. Well, angustifolia is a swamp plant. It grows out in all these wet prairies out here, and it's quite stunning when you see it in bloom. It just needs to dry down when it can. So it won't grow underwater, but wet soil to marginally saturated soil, and then dry in the summer. Perfect environment, which makes it a really great candidate for working in home landscapes. Because there's a lot of situations we run into where we can't use really drought stuff because they hate the water, and we can't use the wetland stuff because we don't want to irrigate it. This takes both ends of it pretty well. Substantial plant. I mean, the foliage mass 18 to 24 inches, and the flower above that, and the flower can be palm-sized, so it's a big flower and quite a show. One of the reasons it doesn't got more attention is when it's blooming, nobody's walking. Those environments are so wet that they're typically not heavily trafficked on foot traffic during the bloom cycle. So this plant is occasionally available as a young transplant because of the taproot nature. It does make it a little harder to transplant. It is pretty common to see it available as seed. The germination rate is incredibly low, so if you're wanting to establish Wildflower, do put plenty of seed out there to make sure you get a good take. Okay, so that's kind of a coverage of some of our better native annuals and perennials from seed and bulb. I'm going to talk a little bit about using these in your home landscapes. The first thing to understand is that it is kind of critical to match the plant with what you have for a site. We have plants that are adaptable to any given site location you're likely to run into in Western Oregon, but you have to pick the right plants, and you can't expect all native plants to thrive in all sites. Though they are native, they still don't appreciate the very poor soil that happens after you like tear what little topsoil we have off of the ground and till it up. So make sure you do some amending or site prep, especially for bulb planting. That's not such a big issue with the seeds. Coarse compost or even some sand in, or building up a little bit to improve the drainage. You know, I grew up just north of the valley, and the soil profiles are completely different. This clay is ridiculous. It's very hard to establish much into. So you may need to build up a bit or do some other soil amending to get certain plants to survive. That being said, if you don't want to, there are natives that will take the wet, heavy clay with very little adaptation. As I mentioned in the earlier section, it's very important to note that a lot of our native bulbs do not tolerate summer irrigation. So you have to, if you're working with them, you have to provide the right site and then stop watering. You can't work with them around plants that need water. That being said, that is a very critical niche, because what do we have out here in North Corvallis? We have oak savanna. And if you develop a housing area around oak savanna and you throw a lawn under that and you start irrigating it, a decade or so, those oaks die. Even our mature oaks do not tolerate consistent summer watering. So these are some plants that you can incorporate with some native grasses, maybe some of these native ground covering materials, and have an established landscape that looks good without irrigating it and without damaging your oak trees.
Is that all oak trees?
It's our native Garrya oak, Oregon white oak. That is certainly not true of all oaks. There's plenty of swamp oaks from other parts of the world. A lot of California oaks have similar characteristics, and you know, if you put a grass under them and you water it once a month to keep the grass alive but not thriving and green, they'll take that. It's the constant 2 or 3 times a week irrigation on that crown. That's what kills oaks. They will not take it. So yeah, be aware of that. So important to get your bulb depth planting right when you're planting native bulbs. They're a little less forgiving than daffodils, for example. So you want to get your tiers at least approximately right. Shallow bulbs are things like shooting star and fritillary, and they're typically around to 2 inches deep. They don't want much depth to them at all. If you get them very deep, they won't break surface well, and you'll have a decline. The bulbs will rot down. Moderate depth, this would be very similar to planting hyacinth bulbs, maybe, or some of the daffodil bulbs. A whole slew of our native bulbs like that depth. So around 4, maybe 5 inches deep. We can do all the chamases, many of the flowering onions, brodias, trichlias, eucows, fawn lilies. Even though the bulbs are tiny, do take the time to get them down to that elevation. It really is important for their long-term survival. We only have a few deep teeth. And so again, in the non-native stuff, this would be the bigger hyacinths, the bigger daffodils go down 6 or 7 inches deep. In our natives, greater camas, Camasia lake will tolerate that, and the calicortus, the mariposas, will tolerate that. Most of our other bulbs do not tolerate being quite that deep, so be aware of that. When you talk about seeding our native plants, the vast majority of our native plants from seed require the cold stratification, as I said at the outset. So fall planting is really the game. Many of the perennials can be direct sown. A lot of the chancier ones are definitely better to just start transplants yourself and then transplant them out for the economical benefit of doing it that way. Really, to get a good coverage on native seeds, your best bet is to put some sort of a filler in with them. If you look at these little seed packets that we're selling, this little package here is slated for around 100 square feet, and we're being just totally conservative. If you were doing this on a restoration job, you'd say that's 1,000 square feet, and we want you to put plenty of seed down so you have a good take. So picture putting that much seed down on 100 square feet without filler. You're going to be patchy. You're going to have a really random scattering. So instead, if you put about 1 part seed to about 3 parts vermiculite, or I like coir, coconut husk fiber, fine coir fiber, just rehydrate it. It makes this nice, almost peat moss-like material. But mix the seed in with these lightly moistened fillers, and then spread the filler, and you'll get a much more even distribution of plants throughout that area. Also tends to keep a little bit of moisture around the seeds as they germinate, especially if you push your planting season to the front end of the season a little bit. So the problem with seeding is that lots of things start growing in the same time as our native wildflower and grass seeds. And a lot of the non-natives, a lot of the weeds that start germinating right about now, can establish really fast, much faster than our natives. So it's important to get a site that's reasonably clear of invasive plants and non-native plants to get a good take on your seed. Now, if you're doing a heavy seeding and you've got at least a reasonable distribution of a reasonable clean out of it, you'll probably be at least reasonably successful. But it's really important for you to get it pure and native. You're going to need to spend about 2 years prepping the site before you really establish the seed. So it's important to start by getting rid of any existing persistent vegetation. So whether that's tilling, which we don't recommend, but burning, pulling, taking the crowns out of more established plants. If you have to till, bring in soil or grade, you want to do all of that and then wait a couple of weeks, see what germinates, go through and kill it out again with burning or with herbicides. But you want to go through that at least a couple of phases, if at all possible, before you try to establish native plants from seed. So that means you really start your summer project for your fall seeding. That being said, you're here today. If you get started right now, you can have this site pretty well ready by roughly Christmas. And that's still plenty of time for our natives to germinate. You'll have a slightly different mix and slightly different percentage of germination out of that, but you'll still get a pretty good take on most of them. So native wildflowers can be inexpensive from seed and bulb. It can be very successful. It can provide some diversity and some particularly wildlife benefits. And it's a good and fun thing to do, whether you're restoring a larger area or just adding some native mix into your existing landscapes. And that's what I had for you for a formal presentation. I'm going to answer a really quick question off the online here. I have a question that is, thanks for the presentation. It has to go back to work. Is there a video recording? Yes. So we are recording this session. We have done previous sessions of this class over the years. We will review this particular talk in comparison to the previous talks, and we'll decide which one stays up on our YouTube channel. We have a full slate of educational programming on the gardening and beekeeping topics on our YouTube channel, and we refresh them every time we do it a little better than the time before, or when we add a new topic on. So do enjoy and watch our YouTube channel for additional material. Do you have any questions here in the room? Yes?
So with clay soil, so it's like all clay soil.
Yeah.
What can you do with it? Do you have to really get the grass out of there to grow native plants?
Right. So when you're working,
Be tilled or what?
yeah. So when you've got a situation that is the pure local native clay, one of the worst sites I've ever seen for clay, actually. What do you do? How do you make this work in a clay site? Well, first of all, given a clay environment, first evaluate your slope drainage situation. So not all clay is created equal. Upland clay on a gray clay will still drain, although it holds moisture for quite a while. Down here on the bottomland divots, that is underwater usually in the winter, or very close to our slurry in the winter, and then dries down quite a bit in the summer. So selecting plants that will tolerate that in the first place. As far as the site prep, tilling is an option. However, every time you till, you're not only destroying your soil biota, your biological or microbials especially, but you're also turning up a whole new crop of buried seed, some of which will germinate. So tilling maybe once if you need to do some soil prep. Then from there, simply a matter of yes, persistent killing out what comes up. And then when you're ready to finally seed, scarify the surface with a rake. So take a hard rake and just create little breaks, because that hard pan clay, when it compacts down and you've killed all the vegetation out of it for 6 months, it creates this very sheer impervious layer right on the surface. Even relatively well-established clay-tolerant plants won't get down into that. So you do need to at least give them something to lodge into to get started. that's kind of the short answer on it. It is somewhat site by site. So if you're planting bulbs in, you definitely need to work with bulbs that thrive in that environment. And with native seeds, I would tend to steer you towards, unless you have specific preferences, towards one of the like tough site mixes, because it's such a wide diversity of plants that guaranteed something will grow in that.
So like canvas.
Mhm. Yeah, so examples of plants that would take that, and Brodia coronaria, both camuses take that. Sidalcias take that surprisingly well. They're done from seed. They're very durable. What else we play with? The irises mostly don't take it quite that clayey.
A lot of them take the like hillside of the place to plant.
Yeah, so when you get up above, in clay, up above the actual flatland, you have a much broader diversity because the water does tend to move around a bit. Once you get off the valley, the pan of the valley floor, and you start adding in things like milkweed, for example, does quite well on those clayey sites that have some moisture retention in the spring and into the early summer, and then drain out well. Question online about starting seeds in flats. You want to start some of these perennials in flats, or even some of the annuals in flats, to have a little better establishment range. Question, first of all, soil recommendations. Always a sterile seed starting mix, so you're not introducing potential pathogens, because one of the biggest risks for emergent seedlings is getting a fungus disease in the roots, and then the whole plant dies off because it's not a big enough plant to resist that. So commercial seed starting mixes, which are primarily a peat perlite or peat pumice blends. When you get those seeds spread out in those flats and go through their germination cycle, just like growing a vegetable start, they'll grow up. You'll get the seed leaves, depending on if they're like liliaceae or other monocots, you'll get one seed leaf, or most of our broadleafs will get 2 seed leaves. And then after the seed leaf stage, you'll start getting true leaves that actually look very much like the adult leaf will look. The seed leaf stage is still operating on stored energy in the germplasm of the seed itself. But as soon as they're past that seed leaf stage and starting to push true leaves, now they are dependent on picking up nutrients from the root system. In a sterile seed starting mix, of course, there are no nutrients present. So you're going to have to start feeding them with something soluble. There's no biology happening. You can't use a granular organic. There are soluble organics to work with. Recommend you feed them, liquid feed them once or twice a week for a couple of weeks or so, depending on the plant, until they get enough maturity that then you can move them either into their site or move them to a larger, like a 4-inch container, or even a 2-inch container, in a more traditional potting soil. And that potting soil has both some nutrients in it, and also the ability then to provide nutrients as an organic granular fertilizer to get them established. Watering is kind of the limiting factor on starting stuff from seed. You've got to keep them moist and steadily moist during their germination, but not sopping wet or they rot. And again, it's not substantially different from actually doing vegetable starts. The time frame is a little bit longer for some of these species, and easily 12, 14, 16 weeks. One of the good ways to play with our native perennials in 6-packs is to throw them in when you have the time, and you can even stick them in the fridge for a few weeks, force the germination. Otherwise, you simply keep them out in the natural weather, because that's what they're adapted to. If you try to put them in a protected environment, like a greenhouse, even an unheated greenhouse, you may not get as good a germination. They have some expectations about what that environment is going to be, and that is our natural weather patterns. Other questions here? Yes.
Bulbs, do you have to rotate them, or you can just leave them on the ground forever?
So our native bulbs can be primarily left in the ground. They tend to naturalize both by vegetatively spreading, by giving vegetative propagation, whether that's a rhizome or whether that's actual little bulbils. A lot of them have a fairly good percentage of seed germination. There's no particular need to lift them. They're very well adapted to our environment. And if you do lift them and divide them, for example, if you want to take what's established out there and then disperse it a little bit wider, you want to time that carefully in the fall. So as the rains come in, they start swelling up after being dehydrated and shriveled. You lift them gently, you transplant them immediately, and you have a pretty good take. But generally speaking, you just leave them be, and they just do what they do.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, other questions here? Other questions online? I want to thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. Always nice to have an exciting natives class, and
you.
hope you enjoyed
Thank
it.
you very much. Thank you.